Leo Carter was never a man of many attachments. At 47, his life fit in the truck's storage compartment and in the silences between one delivery and the next. For more than a decade and a half, he crossed the country's highways, always at the same pace. Engine on, strong coffee, low radio, and eyes fixed on the endless asphalt. At that time, it was winter, a kind that could cut your face even with the window closed, and Leo had just loaded the truck with auto parts in Curitiba. He was heading to the interior of Goiás, planning to stop at a well-known gas station along the way, take a hot shower, grab something simple to eat, and continue the journey the next day. It was an almost automatic routine, a series of repeated gestures that made him feel as if he had some control over his own existence. The past, the one he made sure never to mention, seemed buried miles away. But that night, fate decided to cross the road abruptly, like a wild animal in the middle of the asphalt. It was nearly 2 in the morning when Leo spotted something strange in the distance, on the shoulder covered by dense fog. At first, he thought it was just a garbage bag or perhaps a hit animal. But as he got closer, he noticed something different. There was movement. Something small, irregular, fragile. He braked suddenly, the tires squealing softly in the damp cold. He got out of the cab with his worn jacket still barely buttoned and walked to the spot. There, almost fused to the frozen ground, lay a young woman. Fine clothes, bluish skin, lips trembling between almost imperceptible moans. She looked as if she had been forgotten by the world. Leo didn't think twice. He scooped her up as if she were made of glass and ran back to the truck. In that instant, he didn't yet know that in his arms he was carrying the beginning of a twist that would change everything. Inside the cab, Leo carefully arranged the young woman on the passenger seat, aware that any sudden movement could mean the difference between keeping someone alive or losing everything forever. His calloused hands, accustomed to changing tires in the mud and handling heavy loads, now trembled slightly as they held a worn-out blanket he always kept for emergencies. That girl, who seemed more like a lost specter amid the cold and darkness, now struggled to breathe, her eyes half closed as if fighting to avoid disappearing. Leo turned the heater to full blast and looked for something warm in the thermos bottle, a coffee that had gone cold, but that might serve to try and revive her. Gradually, color returned to her face, even if too pale to reassure him. Not knowing what else to do except keep her alive, he drove for another hour until he found a 24-hour gas station, one of those almost forgotten by time, with yellowish lights and an attendant who seemed to be there only out of obligation. He didn't want to draw attention. He wasn't exactly sure who that girl was, nor what had brought her to that state, but something inside him said he couldn't simply leave her. While she slept wrapped in blankets on the front seat, Leo got out of the truck and walked to the station's counter. He asked for a fresh coffee, lit a cigarette, and stood there watching the empty road through the grimy window. His mind, which for years had avoided remembering, now began pulling together loose threads of memories he swore were buried. There was something in that young woman's expression, even while unconscious, that bothered him in a strange way. It wasn't just worry. It was as if he had seen that face before, even if in another version, another time, another context. When he returned to the truck, she had awakened. Her eyes, still cloudy, met his with a mixture of fear and relief. And it was then, in that moment of piercing silence, that Leo felt a subtle but decisive change. Something had shifted inside him, something that would never be the same again. The first thing she managed to say was a name, or part of it. Ava, she whispered, as if trying to remember herself. Her voice came out hoarse, dry, almost a breath. Leo grabbed a water bottle from the console and helped her drink slowly, tilting the cup until her lips absorbed the liquid. She coughed, but soon began to breathe more regularly. She didn't seem physically injured, at least not in any visible way, but her gaze was that of someone who had been fleeing from something far longer than her body could bear. Leo, not exactly knowing what to ask, simply observed. Ava, right? he said in a low tone, trying not to startle her. She just nodded and, for a few seconds, closed her eyes again, as if the effort of speaking had been too much. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, but there was something in her marked features, deep eyes, and restrained demeanor that made her seem older. Not in age, but in experience. Leo knew that kind of silence. It was the silence of someone carrying too much inside and not knowing where to start telling. He decided that he would continue driving until he reached a larger city where he could take her to a hospital or find some shelter. But something inside him already said the situation wasn't that simple. Ava seemed to carry more than just cold and fear. There was a weight about her, something unspoken, an invisible secret hanging between them from the very first glance. As he drove, Leo tried to keep his focus on the road, but the rearview mirror revealed her eyes, now awake, following every movement, as if trying to understand whether she was safe or merely trading one danger for another. "Do you have family? Anyone to call?" he asked, breaking the silence. Ava hesitated. For an instant, the air seemed to stop. "I can't go back," she replied firmly, with a tone that contrasted with her frail body. Leo didn't press further. He had heard that before, and he knew that when someone says they can't go back, it's because the past is more dangerous than any road ahead. In the following hours, the road remained empty, as if even the world had slowed down to accompany that strange silence between them. Leo wasn't good at conversations, nor did he know how to deal with wounded people. But there was something about Ava that kept him alert, a kind of attentiveness he hadn't felt in years. She alternated between brief naps and lost gazes out the window, as if searching in the landscape for something that reminded her of who she was or what she needed to do. Leo, on the other hand, drove as he always had, with both eyes on the asphalt, but his mind wandering in dangerous directions. Her name still echoed in his head, reverberating something uncomfortable, familiar, disconcerting. He tried to push the idea away, but gradually, like a crack widening over time, the memory began to take shape. Caldwell. That surname was an old poison he had tried to forget, but which now pulsed within him like a poorly healed wound. When they stopped at a larger gas station, close to the state border, Leo decided to refuel and let Ava rest a bit. He offered her a shower in the station's bathroom and a simple snack. Ava accepted with a wary look, but without resistance. While she was out of the cab, Leo went to the back of the station and lit another cigarette, trying to organize his thoughts. If he was right about her surname, that made everything even graver than he had imagined. He had met Vincent Caldwell years ago, when he still flirted with the kind of life he now made sure to hide. Back then, Leo was a cargo driver for loads that couldn't be invoiced, did escorts for dangerous men, participated in meetings where a wrong look could mean death. Vincent was a shadow hovering over all that. He didn't speak loudly, but when he did, everyone fell silent. He was the kind of man who made the devil look like an intern, and now his daughter, if that's really what she was there, sleeping in the seat of his truck. When Ava returned from her shower, her eyes no longer seemed so heavy, though exhaustion still cloaked every gesture like an invisible mantle. Leo offered the snack with a simple gesture, without words. She accepted, and the two ate in silence, sitting side by side in the cab. It was then that he decided to get straight to the point. "Your surname is Caldwell, isn't it?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the dark horizon of the road. Ava froze for a few seconds, the bread still half-eaten in her hands. It was as if that name had a physical weight that prevented her from breathing. "Yes," she replied softly, almost swallowing the word. Leo nodded, but inside an avalanche was beginning to form. "Do you know who I am?" he ventured, staring at her now directly. Ava observed him for a few seconds, as if calculating her answer. "I know you're Leo Carter, and I know that my father has talked about you, not in a good way." That confirmed everything Leo feared. He was trapped again in the very web from which he had fought so hard to escape. Ava took a deep breath before continuing. But I'm not here by chance. It wasn't luck that you crossed my path on that road. I came after you." The sentence hit Leo like a dry punch to the gut. He fell silent, but his expression hardened. Ava noticed the impact, but pressed on. "I discovered things that even my father never imagined I'd be able to access. I found files, contracts, recordings, a list of names, politicians, businessmen, judges, military men, all involved in a dirty network that he leads. I copied everything, and now they want me dead." The world seemed to spin in slow motion for a moment. Leo looked out the window, trying to process what he had just heard. She wasn't just a girl running away from a controlling father. She was a ticking time bomb about to explode, and he was sitting right next to her. Leo took several seconds to speak, but when he did, his voice came out firm, dry, as if using a tone he had kept at the back of his throat for years. "Do you have any idea what this means?" he asked, more to himself than to Ava. She nodded slowly, but there was something in the way she faced the situation that bothered Leo. It wasn't naivete, but it wasn't experience either. It was that kind of courage born when a person has nothing left to lose. Ava took the worn backpack she'd been carrying from the start, and from inside it, pulled out a small black USB drive with a red ribbon tied around it. "It's all here. The files, the records, even audio conversations she had with politicians. This is the end of his empire, if I can get it into the right hands." Leo took the USB drive, looked at it for a few seconds, and returned it. "You have no idea how big this shit is. You're not at risk. You're already marked." Ava lowered her eyes, as if she'd known this from the beginning. He knew that from that moment on, there was no turning back. If Ava had found him, it meant that someone else could too. And the problem with dealing with these kinds of people is that they don't send messages or threats. They send bodies. Leo got up, walked to the station's public phone, dialed a number he hadn't used in over a decade, and waited. On the other end, a tired voice answered. "Rains," said Leo directly. "I need you." On the other end of the line, silence for a moment, then a short, almost cynical laugh. "I knew one day you'd call me again." Ethan Rains was the kind of person who only showed up when everything was falling apart. An ex-intelligence agent, an expert in making people vanish and uncovering things that no one else could trace. If there was any chance of surviving this situation, it was with him. 2 hours later, Leo and Ava were back on the road, heading toward an address Leo knew only from memory. A place hidden among rugged hills and twisted trees, where Ethan used to isolate himself from the world. It was a route he hadn't taken in more than 10 years, but the path was still etched into him like a scar. In the silence of the journey, Ava clutched the USB drive tightly in her hands, as if it were her only anchor to reality. Leo noticed this detail, the way she held it not as an object but as a shield, a last chance. He had seen that kind of look in other people, the look of someone who knows that if this fails, everything is lost. As he drove, he remembered the days when he himself had lived in the shadow of concealed weapons and whispered orders. The world that Ava was trying to take down was the same one that had once nearly swallowed him whole, and now he found himself dragged back, not by choice, but by humanity. When they finally arrived at Ethan's refuge, the place seemed even more isolated than Leo remembered. It was a simple wooden house, old and leaning against hills, protected by dense trees and an improvised gate made of hand-welded metal pieces. Ethan appeared at the door with his usual cynical expression, unshaven, small, alert eyes, and that sarcastic demeanor of someone who had seen the worst in the world and still wasn't impressed by anything. "Did you bring trouble?" he asked even before greeting them. Leo simply nodded and introduced Ava. Ethan examined her from head to toe, his suspicion barely hidden. When Ava showed him the USB drive, his expression changed. He took the object, went straight to the old computer he kept hidden in a compartment on the floor of the living room, and began sifting through the data. Half an hour later, he turned around, serious. "This is much bigger than you imagine." While Ethan navigated the files with the cold agility of someone used to handling sensitive material that couldn't be trusted to anyone else, Leo watched Ava sitting silently, her shoulders slumped as if carrying the full weight of that revelation. The room was enveloped in a tense silence, interrupted only by the crisp clicks of the old keyboard. "This isn't just a list of corruption," Ethan said, not taking his eyes off the screen. "It's a map of how power really works in this country." He went on to describe the contents precisely: offshore accounts, illegal campaign transactions, deals with militias, money laundering through shell companies. But what caught attention the most was one specific name: an influential senator, known for his moralistic and conservative speech, repeatedly appeared in transactions with Vincent Caldwell. It was the kind of scandal that, if revealed, would shake entire structures. Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked at both of them. "If we leak this, do you have any idea what's going to happen? This isn't going to end with a shot in the dark. It's going to spark a war, and you'll be right in the center." Leo didn't answer immediately. He stood up, walked around the room, looked out the window as if seeking an answer that wouldn't come. He knew what was at stake, but he also knew what it was like to live hiding, pretending that nothing could ever reach you. Ava, for her part, seemed different. For the first time, she wasn't just scared, she was determined. "I don't want to run anymore," she said firmly, staring Ethan in the eye. "If I die with this hidden, it's as if I've accepted everything my father represents." Leo sat back down, more slowly now, as if that phrase had broken a part of him from the inside, because he understood. It was exactly what he had been doing for years, running, hiding, trying to pretend that his inaction made him clean. Ethan let out a long sigh. "Then you need a plan, one that makes it impossible to silence this. And quickly, because when those people catch wind of a leak, they won't send a message, they'll send fire." The idea came in the middle of the night, after hours of debate and scribbled lists on sheets of paper spread across the table. Ethan proposed something bold. Instead of delivering the material to a single outlet, they should disseminate everything on multiple fronts simultaneously. Independent press, digital activist networks, hacker groups, investigative journalists, and even international bodies. If they attack one, the others will already have everything. "There's no way to hold back a chain leak," he explained. Leo listened intently, processing every detail with that practical manner of someone who had never trusted wild plans. But for the first time, he felt they had a chance. Ava, by his side, noted everything with concentration, absorbing technical instructions and contact names as if she were training for a mission. There was a new spark in her eyes, not relief, but purpose. It was as if she had finally found a greater reason to face what was coming. During the next 2 days, the trio plunged into an intense, silent routine of preparation. Ethan took care of encrypting the files, sending fragmented portions to different locations, and reactivating old contacts in the underworld of information. Leo handled security, altering routes, setting up improvised barriers around the property, testing emergency exits, and keeping the truck always fueled, ready to leave in seconds. And Ava, surprisingly, adapted quickly to the pressure. She recorded short videos, clearly explained parts of the documents, and prepared impactful messages so that the content would gain force when it reached the public. She was no longer just Vincent Caldwell's daughter. It was someone who had decided to break the cycle of silence and fear. But deep down, everyone knew. As soon as they acted, the enemy would soon realize that something was in motion, and when that happened, time would cease to be an ally. The confirmation that the net was closing in came discreetly, a coded message sent by one of Ethan's contacts. "They're after you. The bounty on Ava is already circulating among the right groups, and it's not small." That changed the rhythm of the house. From that point on, every unusual noise made Leo walk straight to the door with his hand on his waist, where he now kept an old gun inherited from a time he preferred to forget. Ava, as firm as she appeared, started sleeping less, almost always with her eyes open, as if her body refused any bit of vulnerability. Ethan reinforced the protocols, but it was clear. The peace they had enjoyed in the last few days was numbered, and it wasn't long before reality exploded. Literally, 3 cars arrived at dusk, silent, with no license plates, with headlights off and armed men stepping out with automatic weapons, walking as if they already knew the way. Leo noticed the movement in the reflection on the truck's external mirror. He shouted for Ava and Ethan even before the first shot was heard. Everything happened too quickly. Shots tearing through windows, shards flying through the room, the wooden wall crumbling like wet paper. Ethan pulled Ava toward a side exit, while Leo held off the attackers with short, precise shots. He wasn't a soldier, but he wasn't an amateur either. He still remembered everything he had learned in the darkest corners of his past. But he knew they wouldn't last much longer. That's when he made his decision. He ran to the shed next to the house, where Ethan kept old gas cylinders used for welding. He prepared everything quickly, without a second thought, and shouted for the 2 to run. When the first invader entered the shed, Leo shot the main cylinder. The explosion came seconds later, shaking everything around. A wall of fire swallowed the attackers, creating a unique chance for escape. The escape was instinctive, almost blind. The heat from the explosion still burned their clothes as Leo, Ava, and Ethan ran along the access trail at the back of the property, dodging branches, stones, and mud, with the smell of gunpowder still clinging to the air. Leo drove with his reflexes on high alert, breathing heavily, eyes fixed on the road as the truck tore through the dark asphalt in a hurry. Ethan, in the back seat, still tried to stabilize the connection with his contacts using an old notebook adapted to a mobile security system that seemed improvised but was effective. Ava, though scared, didn't cry. There was a new hardness in her, a kind of resilience that only emerges when death comes too close. And there, amidst that chaos, Leo felt something he hadn't expected to feel, a sense of purpose. For the first time in years, he wasn't just crossing roads aimlessly. He was fighting for something that mattered. He was protecting someone in need. And that changed everything. In the following days, while they alternated between temporary hideouts and remote connections with Ethan's allies, the material kept being spread. The revelations began to pop up on alternative websites, investigative blogs, forums, and independent channels. Social networks exploded with snippets of audios, leaked spreadsheets, videos with irrefutable evidence. And with every new post, more journalists got involved, more people took interest, and more pieces of that puzzle began to fit together. When the senator's name appeared, directly linked to illegal offshore accounts, the traditional press couldn't ignore it. The story exploded on the news, and with it came the inevitable. Political chaos, confused press conferences, allies denying involvement, emergency investigations. But in the midst of that storm, one name was still out of sight: Vincent Caldwell. Leo knew that that man wouldn't fall easily. He was the kind of enemy who bleeds internally before collapsing externally, and it was only a matter of time before he made his next move. Vincent Caldwell appeared on national TV 2 days later with the same cold, calculated demeanor that Leo remembered from the old days. The speech was rehearsed, full of negatives, conspiracy accusations, and a pathetic attempt to appear as a victim of a political setup. But anyone who had come close to that man knew it was just smoke before the fire. Ava watched the broadcast in silence, sitting in the corner of a cheap hotel, her hands folded in her lap and her jaw set. Leo was by her side, but he said nothing. He knew that the pain she felt was not just from fear, it was grief. Grief for the father she once believed might have existed. Grief for everything that was destroyed before it was even built. Ethan, from the other side of the room, just murmured, "He's retreating. That's desperation, and when men like him get desperate, they kill." The phrase hung in the air like an inevitable sentence. That night, Ava allowed herself to break down. For the first time, since Leo found her by the roadside, she cried. It wasn't a contained, timid cry. It was a wrenching sob that came from deep within, as if she had finally allowed the pain to emerge from where it had been hidden. Leo sat there, silently beside her, saying nothing, simply respecting that moment. When she finally stopped, breathing deeply between sobs, he said something simple that broke the silence once and for all. "You're not alone." Ava looked at him, as if those words carried more weight than any promise. For the first time, she believed it, because it wasn't just about exposing crimes or taking down an empire. It was about rebuilding herself. And in that instant, even surrounded by chaos, Ava began to feel that maybe there was a possible way forward. Not an easy one, not a safe one, but a possible one. The next morning, the mood in the country was different. Newspapers splashed headlines that seemed straight out of a movie script. Corruption scandals, the involvement of influential public figures, secret operations being dismantled. But what really set off the alarm was the leak of a video clip where Vincent Caldwell appeared in a clandestine meeting with the already investigated senator, openly talking about payments and threats. That took the breath away from many. There was no longer room for doubts or manipulations. It was the beginning of the end. Ethan received word that an arrest warrant for Vincent was about to be issued. Even so, he insisted, "Don't be fooled. Until he falls, he'll try to drag someone down with him." And he was right. That same afternoon, news came that people connected to the investigation were being threatened. 2 of them had already disappeared. Leo felt the danger approaching once again, like a breeze before the storm. The tension became routine in the following days. Leo and Ava didn't stay in one place for more than 24 hours. They slept in improvised locations with their bags ready to leave at any moment. But even with constant fear, there was a different feeling growing, a kind of connection between the two that went beyond protection. Leo, who had always lived on the margins, began to see himself as something more. And Ava, who before was just about escape and resistance, now also embodied courage and new beginnings. One night, when the group took shelter in an old abandoned warehouse, she looked at him with raw sincerity. "I know you could have left me on that road, and sometimes I wonder why you didn't." Leo replied without hesitation, "Because you saved me too. You just haven't realized it yet." Ava said nothing, but the look between them said more than any word. There, even hidden in the middle of nowhere, a spark of light was emerging at the end of the road. The following week, Vincent Caldwell's arrest was finally confirmed. The entire country watched, live, as images showed him being handcuffed while exiting a helicopter escorted by federal agents. The man who for decades commanded a dark empire was now just another name on the news, his expression empty, as if he knew he had lost everything. Ava watched the scene in silence, without celebration. It was strange, not relief, not euphoria, just a hard-to-explain emptiness. Perhaps because true victory wasn't about seeing the father arrested, but knowing that finally she no longer had to run. Leo watched from the side, respecting her silence. He knew that Vincent's downfall didn't erase the years lived under his shadow, but he also knew that something new was beginning, a different cycle, where Ava would finally have the choice of who she wanted to be, without carrying the weight of a surname that had always been a sentence. In the days that followed, the trio separated. Ethan returned to his hideout, promising to vanish for a while, as he always did after each storm. Leo and Ava continued on the road, but this time without haste, without a planned route, just the road ahead. At one of the stops, in a small town in the interior, Ava began talking about plans. She wanted to study journalism, perhaps work in whistleblowing, help other people with stifled stories. It was a sincere desire, though still in its infancy. Leo listened attentively, without interrupting, just smiling with that reserved way of showing support through presence rather than words. And, in that moment, amid simple coffees and unknown voices around them, the two seemed, finally, to breathe another kind of air. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was the beginning of a life where fear wasn't the only fuel. And that, for both of them, was already a revolution. One night, already settled in a small makeshift chalet on the outskirts of a quiet village, Leo woke with a thought he couldn't ignore. For years, he had lived as if time didn't matter, days the same, landscapes repeating, people coming and going without leaving marks. But now, everything felt different. There was a strange purpose taking shape, something he couldn't name, but that made him want to stay. He slowly got out of the improvised bed and walked to the wooden porch, where the starry sky seemed closer than anywhere else. He stayed there for a while, thinking about everything that had happened. Ava soon appeared, wrapped in a blanket, sitting beside him without a word. It was as if they both understood that the shared silence said more than any conversation. She rested her head on his shoulder and sighed deeply. "I think, for the first time, I'm feeling at peace," she whispered. Leo closed his eyes for a second and replied, "That's what freedom looks like, Ava. You only recognize it when you live it." The following days were filled with small things, simple tasks like cooking, fixing a creaky door, strolling through the local market. And curiously, it was in that unpretentious everyday life that the two began to truly find each other, not as fugitives or survivors, but as whole people, with scars, yes, but willing to move forward. Ava started jotting down ideas in an old notebook, scribbling projects for articles and documentaries she wanted to produce in the future. Leo, for his part, didn't talk about plans, but he made sure to be present in every detail, fixing the chalet's roof, planting herbs in the yard, quietly laughing at the exaggerated stories of the local residents. The road was still part of him, but for the first time in years, he allowed himself to stop, and Ava, with her silent strength and determined look, seemed to be the only person capable of making him want to stay. It was during a casual conversation with a village elder that Ava had the idea of anonymously sending letters to the families of some of the people listed in the documents she had helped expose. Not as a form of confrontation, but as a gesture of rupture, as if to say, "I won't carry this burden alone." Leo found it strange at first, but he didn't interfere. He knew that this was more about her than anyone else. Ava wrote the letters by hand, with raw sincerity, without accusations or blame, just with the naked, direct truth. Some of those letters were answered, others not. But she said that just the act of writing was enough. It was her way of reconnecting with the world outside the shadows, of giving back a little of the humanity her father had tried to erase. And it was in that process that Leo understood. Ava wasn't just overcoming a difficult history. She was transforming that pain into action. One afternoon, while cleaning the inside of the truck, something Leo always did whenever he needed to organize his thoughts, he found, among the seats, the blanket he had used on the night he found Ava. He spent a while looking at it, remembering the cold of that road, the way she almost disappeared into her own bones. He ran his hand over the fabric as if touching a living memory, and in that moment, he felt a tightening in his chest, not from sadness, but from gratitude. That unlikely encounter had changed everything. He thought about how many lives might have passed him by on that road, how many stories he would never know. But Ava was different. She appeared like an accident of fate, but stayed as a turning point. Leo felt that in some way he had been saved too, because Ava pulled him back to life, not in a spectacular or magical way, but with truth. And for someone like him, that was more than enough. Over time, the two built a simple yet meaningful routine. It wasn't a life of grand plans or certainties, but it was a real life, built with small gestures that carried more weight than words. Leo, who before lost himself in the roots and the noises of the road, now found meaning in the silence of the mornings, in the sound of the wood stove alight, in the smell of slowly brewed coffee. Ava, for her part, blossomed. Every day she appeared more confident, more present, as if finally occupying a space that had always been hers, one that fear had prevented her from reaching. She spoke with the locals, organized small fairs, helped out at the community library. The village began to see her not as a stranger, but as someone who truly belonged. And Leo observed it all with that calm look of someone who had learned that transformation doesn't happen with shouts, but over time and with care. One late afternoon, sitting on the step of the porch, Ava looked at Leo and said something he hadn't expected to hear. "Have you ever thought about stopping for good with the road?" This question hung in the air like a warm breeze cutting through the silence. Leo took a moment to respond. He looked toward the horizon where the sun was hiding behind the hills and said, almost without thinking, "Yes, but I never thought I had a place to stay." Ava smiled, saying nothing, just leaning her shoulder on his, as if that alone was the answer. And in that simple gesture, Leo felt what he perhaps hadn't felt, even in the days he believed he was free: belonging. It wasn't about the place itself, but about the presence, about being with someone who saw him completely without him having to say a word. And that, for a man who had spent decades on the move, was everything. In the days that followed that conversation, Leo began to allow himself to think about something he had never given himself permission for: to stop. Not to cease existing, not to stop living, but to stop running. For the first time in many years, he considered that maybe it wasn't necessary to always be on the run, always with one foot on the road and the other on the brake. He began talking with the owner of a small depot in the neighboring town who needed help with local deliveries and truck maintenance. It was simpler work, with predictable hours, without risks, without hurry, and somehow that felt comfortable to him. Ava supported him without question. She knew that for him, accepting a slower pace was as challenging as facing an armed pursuit. But he was trying. He was learning how to be, to build, even if with small bricks, a life that didn't depend on constant tension to feel real. Meanwhile, Ava finally secured an opportunity with an independent journalistic organization that had closely followed the leaks she and Ethan had made. It wouldn't be a permanent position, but a chance to collaborate on investigations and reports that gave voice to silent stories. She was nervous at first, afraid of exposing herself, of being identified again, of everything falling apart once more. But Leo encouraged her, not with speeches or cliches, but with his calm way of looking into her eyes and saying, "Go ahead, even if you're scared, just don't let fear stop you." That phrase became a sort of motto between them, and Ava did. She wrote, reported, listened to people in pain, gave names to what was once invisible. Gradually, she stopped being just Vincent Caldwell's daughter and began to be recognized for her own voice, her own work. And deep down, she knew that without that unlikely encounter by the roadside, none of this would have been possible. Months later, Leo and Ava found themselves back on the road where it all began. It was her idea, a sort of silent agreement with the past. They parked the truck at the very spot where he had found her, on that freezing night that now seemed to belong to another life. The shoulder was the same, dry grass, asphalt with small cracks, and the silence cutting the air as before. But something there had changed, even if everything appeared the same. Ava got out slowly, looked around, and stood for a few minutes, taking a deep breath, unhurried. Leo stayed in the truck, watching. No words were needed. He knew she needed that moment alone. When she returned, she carried a small bunch of wildflowers in her hands. She placed them on the ground without any ceremony and whispered something he couldn't hear, but respected. It was a personal ritual, an intimate gesture, and in that instant, he realized Ava wasn't burying a memory. She was honoring her own survival. On the way back to the truck, she smiled at him, a different smile, lighter, more filled with truth. Leo started the engine, and the two continued their journey, without plans, without hurry. The road was no longer a place of escape, but a bridge between two times, the one before and the one now. On the radio, some song filled the comfortable silence between them. and for the first time, Leo wasn't thinking about the destination. It didn't matter where they were headed, nor how long it would take. What mattered was being there with someone who carried scars like him, but who still believed in new beginnings. That road had seen many paths lost, but that day, it witnessed two paths meeting, and this time, it wasn't by chance. Over time, Leo realized something curious. The silence that once accompanied him as a burden was now different. It was no longer the silence of loneliness, but of peace, a kind of silence that comes when the soul stops. Screaming inside, he still kept a low profile, still spoke little, but something in his demeanor had changed. He was more present, more attentive, less hurried. Conversations with Ava became more frequent, more open, filled with sincere exchanges and even laughter, something rare, almost extinct in him. Sometimes he found himself laughing at simple things, at everyday stories, at silly situations at the local market, or a dog that always tried to steal bread from the village bakery. And those small scenes, once insignificant, began to form what he now understood as life. It wasn't about great achievements, but about being wholly present, day after day, alongside someone who demanded nothing more than truth. Ava, too, blossomed in a unique way. Her writings began to circulate, gaining recognition, and some of her denunciations led to new investigations. But she wasn't seduced by the spotlight. She knew exactly where she came from and what she didn't want to repeat, and more. Importantly, she knew that her strength wasn't in exposure, but in consistency. Leo admired that in her. Sometimes he would just watch as she typed, her hair disheveled and her eyes fixed on the screen, determined, firm, intense. It was hard to believe that that woman had been the same young, almost lifeless person by the roadside months ago, but she was, and that only made everything more powerful. Her transformation wasn't a miracle. It was resistance, it was choice. And Leo, in his own way, had transformed too, not with speeches or grand decisions, but with small, courageous, real gestures. That's how life began again, one day at a time. A few months later, while walking through the village, Leo was approached by a young trucker who recognized him. "You're Carter, aren't you? The guy who disappeared from the roads for a while. They say you faced some heavy stuff back then." Leo just smiled slightly without confirming or denying. The young man continued admiringly, as if Leo were some sort of legend. But what Leo thought in that moment was that for the first time, he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. His story was alive, marked in every step he took, but now he no longer had to carry it as a burden. It was just a part of who he was, and not what defined him. After the young man left, Leo stood for a few minutes, looking at the sky, feeling the wind on his face. It was simple, almost banal, but in that moment he knew he had won. Not in the way the world expected, but in the truest way possible. That very night, Ava appeared with an envelope in her hands. It was an informal invitation to speak at an event about press freedom and the fight against corruption. She hesitated as she showed it, saying that she still felt small in the face of everything. But Leo, with that secure and calm look, simply replied, "You have no idea how big you are." She smiled, and he smiled too. There wasn't a happy ending in the traditional sense. There were still wounds, memories, challenges, but there was life, there was a path, and most importantly, there was choice. The road now was no longer escape. It was destiny, it was reunion, it was a beginning, and even though they didn't know what would come next, they already had the most important thing, the certainty that they were no longer alone. Months later, when Leo decided to sell the truck, he didn't feel the pain he had imagined. That vehicle, which for so many years had been his home, his refuge, his world, was now just a part of the road he had traveled. He cleaned every corner carefully, like a ritual of silent farewell, but without regret. It was time to let it go. Ava was with him on the day of the handover, watching everything with respect. She knew how much that truck meant, and when he handed the key to the new owner, Leo looked at her and said, "Now it's official. I don't have to run anymore." And he really didn't. The road was no longer the only way to feel free. He had built a new path, a path where he could finally stop, breathe, and live. And there, in front of everything he was leaving behind, he felt strongly that he was exactly where he was meant to be. At the end of that same day, Ava wrote a new entry in her notebook, a simple page without grand phrases or wild plans, just a short sentence. It all began with cold, but ended with shelter. And perhaps that was exactly it. Life sometimes organizes itself in unexpected ways. And in that story, between gunshots, escape, pain, and courage, what remained was what no one expected: affection, trust, and rebuilding. Leo Carter, the man who had crossed the country alone for over a decade, was now walking alongside someone. And Ava Caldwell, the young woman marked by a dark surname, was now writing her own story, with steady hands, an uplifted gaze, and freedom as her destiny. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, subscribe, share it with your friends, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update.